Chapter 17. A Festival of Vermin and Lost Children, in which the rats come home to roost. Outfitted with half a dozen hidden daggers, and at least 20 other concealed implements of murder, carrying frost in its hard plastic case, Peter entered Hamlin's Altstadt, the old town, and almost left the modern Mundy city behind. Almost. The cobbled streets were similar to the medieval town of his youth, and many of the oldest of the old buildings constructed in the over-ornamented Weser Renaissance style looked vaguely familiar, if somewhat smaller than he remembered. But no matter how deep into the past he'd seemed to regress at any time, all he had to do was to look up and see the sky punctured on all sides by a small forest of massive steel construction cranes completely surrounding the old town section, busy adding new towers of chrome-tinted glass and brushed steel to the greater metropolitan skyline. And of course this version of Hamlin, even in the old section, was much too clean to truly reflect the Hamlin of his past, or any medieval-era town for that matter. These cobblestone streets were swept. There weren't corpses set out into the thoroughfare to be removed. There were no piles of human waste and discarded refuse rotting in every alleyway, which in turn meant that there weren't the attendant clouds of gnats, fleas, and flies everywhere, or the ubiquitous rats. In the lost Hesse's version of Hamlin, even after the Pied Piper's miracles, the rats eventually returned, though the stolen children never did. Granted, there were plenty of rats to be found here, but they were artificial. The good people of Mundy Hamlin seemed to have embraced the rat as a beloved symbol of its history and heritage. One of the bridges spanning the Weser River had a huge gold-plated statue of a rat mounted at the apex of its overhead suspension superstructure, standing astride the two center tower supports like a vermin colossus. One of the local ice cream shops, where one can purchase ice cream dishes formed into the convincing likenesses of various popular restaurant entrees, such as steak and potatoes or spaghetti and meatballs, had a brightly painted plastic statue outside of its main entrance, depicting a giant ice cream cone of many flavors, which had somehow spilled into the shape of cyclopean rat. There were little plastic wind-up rats, plush stuffed rats, and articulated wooden rats in the windows of every one of the numerous toy stores. Carven stone rats decorated every fountain and building cornice, and painted rats were included in the composition of every bit of commercial signage. Children could ride spring-mounted rocking horse rats in tiny play parks scattered liberally throughout the town, or the larger plastic green, pink, or purple galloping rats in the market square's gigantic motorized carousel. After a battle that lasted centuries, the rats had finally conquered Hamlin Town, much to the approval of its citizens. At this early hour, Peter nearly had the town to himself. Only a few delivery men, hand-carting crates and boxes from their large panel trucks, were also up with the dawn. They were busy restocking the many shops and restaurants, helping Hamlin make its final preparations for the first of its big festival days, which would begin as soon as the town could rouse itself from its nightly slumbers. Peter walked towards the center of town to the open market square, where 100 bright tents in every color of the spectrum had been erected to shelter the visiting food vendors, gaming hosts, and souvenir merchants who would come to occupy them in only a few hours' time. And then past the carousel, which was permanent and operated year-round, he could see the grand old St. Nikolai's, which also turned out to be smaller than the homeland's version of the same building of his past. This one wasn't even a proper cathedral, but only a very large, though still impressive, church. This one was also attached to a smaller copy, though no less ornate, of the Hochzeithaus, the High Holy House, where in a different world Peter had helped to force a frightened and outraged bishop to wed him to Bo. Peter turned away from the church and strolled down Market Street, which had been converted into an open-air walking mall where no motorized vehicles were allowed. Restaurants, small diners, and snack stands lined the street, which also had tables and chairs under shady umbrellas set out in the middle of it. Peter sat down at a random table to wait for one of the restaurants to open up and provide him with breakfast. And even though he was quite alone in the street, he resisted the urge to constantly pat himself down to make sure that all of his deadly secret weapons were still in place. He set Frost's case on the table in front of him and wondered if he shouldn't open it up and play himself a tune. Perhaps the last song I'll ever get to play on it, he thought. A sad and simple little farewell requiem just for myself. Peter looked out of the restaurant window as he finished his breakfast and noticed that the town had woken up at last. A man in a Pied Piper costume strolled past the window, playing merrily on his flute and followed by a half-dozen happy tourists, busy snapping pictures of him with their digital cameras. The piper was dressed in a red and purple tunic, over tights of orange, green, yellow, and white. He sported a cape of many colors and a cap with a trio of 2-foot-long pheasant feathers arcing out from it. He played a modern-style metal transverse flute. Then, less than a minute later, another Pied Piper passed by, going the other way. This one was dressed identically to the first, but played a modern clarinet instead of a flute. In addition to his modest flock of tourists, this one was followed by a troop of children dressed in grey mouse costume pajamas with long cloth tails and hoods that had plush, pink and grey mouse ears sewn onto them. There were at least 30 children in the procession, and they followed their piper in pretended enchantment, dancing and prancing along to his tune. Peter hadn't been able to finish his bacon and eggs. He was too nervous about the coming confrontation to do justice to a full meal. Placing a 20 Deutschmark note on the table for the check, plus a nice tip, he picked up Frost and left the restaurant. Market Street was crowded now. Hundreds of early bird tourists had turned out to soak up every atom of the day's celebrations, which might begin slowly, but would end tonight in grand, drunken feasts, public concerts, and exploding fireworks. Peter turned south, away from the center of town and the largest mass of crowds. Almost immediately, just outside of the old town's post office, around a gradual bend in the street, Peter encountered a large stone fountain depicting the Pied Piper of legend. This was the particular fountain he'd been looking for, the one that appeared, as if by strict regulation, on the cover of every tourist brochure. It had a 5-sided base which enclosed its main pool. A pillar rose out of its center, which blossomed out into a cup-shaped upper pool that was decorated all around its circumference with carvings of parading children, along with the required rats. A life-sized bronze statue of the legendary piper stood up from the stone's cup center, looking nothing at all like his brother Max. This one at least was depicted as playing on a front-held, flare-ended flute, similar to what Max had actually played so many years past. Peter sat on the fountain's edge, setting Frost's case down beside him. There were many coins in the fountain's pool. He dug into his pocket and came out with a copper 10-pfennig piece, which he threw into the pool, making a wish as he did so. And almost at once, perhaps for his many sins, his wish was granted. "My dear long-lost brother!" Max Piper cried in delight. "How extraordinary and how absolutely wonderful to find you here." Chapter 18. Frost and Fire, in which Peter puts his wife in a pumpkin shell and tries to keep her very well. Peter and Bo crouched together below the low green hedgerow that bordered a gently winding country lane. In the 3 months since they'd escaped Hamlin, retrieving various stashes of Peter's loot from scattered hidey-holes, and an equal number of Bo's hidden bundles of exotic weapons from secret caches, they made their way neatly 400 leagues south and westward, across the Hesse, to the outskirts of a southern little seaport town called Sonnensee. Even in October, this was a pleasant, summery land of rolling golden pastures and rich farmlands, occasionally separated by miles-long stretches of high granite hills, on the lower slopes of which could be found the only substantial stands of uncleared woodlands. both of the fugitives were more than happy to have left the deeper, more primeval reaches of the Black Forest far behind. They hid on the landward side of the hedgerow in order to avoid detection from a solitary farmer who was leading a creaking old donkey cart down the road. The ponderous two-wheeled cart was piled high with fresh produce. No doubt the farmer was bringing his harvest goods into Sononsea to sell in the public markets that sprang up in every town and village during the harvest season. This close to the sea, bright white gulls dotted the wide azure sky, their wings tipped with black or grey. Some drifted high, riding the lazy thermals that rose up from the chalky seaside cliffs and inland granite escarpments, while others dived and banked closer to the ground, on the lookout for their next scavenging opportunity. Always they squawked and scolded and called to each other, being a very chatty sort of bird. When the farmer had come very close to their hiding place, Peter and Bo vaulted lightly and easily over the hedge and confronted the man, who was an older fellow, and scrambled backwards, all the while clutching at his chest. "I'm sorry, Grandfather," Bo said. "We didn't mean to startle you. We just needed to make sure that we'd be able to talk to you with no other witnesses. Be assured that we mean you no harm, and we're not thieves." "Well, to be perfectly honest, I am," Peter said, "but not today. In truth, we're here with gold in hand, willing to buy what we want." "At a very good price," Bo added. "What sort of people hide behind bushes only to jump out at innocent, hard-working country folk?" the old farmer said, looking suspicious, accusatory, and still breathing hard, if no longer quite showing a danger of some sort of imminent collapse. "What exactly is it you want from me?" "Everything," Peter said, flashing a jolly smile. "The donkey, the cart, and everything in it. Think of a good price for the lot, and then double it. We're feeling particularly generous today." "And add to that," Bo said, "the cost of ensuring that you'll go straight home from here, back the way you came, where you'll stay for at least a week before venturing to go to town again." "What do you need my cart, my crops, and my Gertrude for?" "We've got it in our hearts to be simple farm folk for a day," Peter said. "For the past 3 months we've been every other sort of folk," Bo said. "We've been an old grandfather and his old wife. I've been an old woman with a grown son, and Peter's been an old man with his grown daughter. Once, even lacking time and materials to fashion disguises, we travelled as a young man and his wife. Now it's time to be something else." To be perfectly candid, Peter said, the gobs and their wicked masters who now rule this land may still be looking for a young married couple travelling together, so we tend to avoid appearing that way. "You're villains on the run?" the old man said. "Hardly villainous," Peter said, "but you've deciphered the crux of it." Bo started pacing around the cart, closely evaluating its bountiful contents, quietly murmuring, and as she made her examinations. "I can't lose my Gertrude for any price," the old man said. "She's become part of the family." "She talks?" Peter said. "No, but—" "Good," Peter said, "because we can't risk anyone speaking up and giving us away as we pass through that rather imposing guard tower, no doubt garrisoned by a squad or more of bloodthirsty goblins, which straddles the last high pass leading down to Sononsea town. Still, I had a beloved family mule of my own once, back in a more innocent age, and I know well the reluctance one might have to part with such a creature. So I'll tell you what, we'll still pay you double, a good sell price for your dear Gertrude, but only to rent her for a week. When next you come to town, you'll find her fine, fit, and nicely fattened at the public stables, and we'll pay for that too." The conversation lasted a good while longer, but eventually the old man, whose name turned out to be Maynard, by the way, gave in, unable to turn down the small fortune in silver and gold that the almost certainly insane young couple pressed upon him. While Peter handled the bulk of the negotiations, Bo kept a wary eye out. Bo kept a wary eye out down one direction and then the other, knowing that any passerby at this point might ruin their plans. After a while, a considerably happier and richer old Maynard went back on his way, down the country road, and entirely out of our story. Once he was well out of earshot, Peter said to his lovely wife, "Okay, that's done. Now will you please tell me why we let 3 perfectly respectable grocery wagons pass us by, but absolutely had to procure this one?" "Because lovely old Gaffer Maynard had the best pumpkins," Bo said. "Look at the size of these giants, this one in particular." She indicated the biggest, fattest pumpkin in the cart, and Peter had to admit that it was truly impressive. "So Maynard had good results from his pumpkin patch this year?" Peter said. "Good for him. Perhaps I'm not as clever as you are, because I don't divine the necessity of big pumpkins among the crop we used to explain our way past the guard post. As long as we appear as humble farmers, that's what I've been thinking about, while we hid among the hedges," Bo said. "So far, we've always appeared as 2 people together on the road. But if the military authorities are still looking for us, or if the agents of your former brotherhood or my former society still hunt us, they'd all be looking for a man and a woman together on the road." "True," Peter said. "In hindsight, we shouldn't have written farewell letters to our respective masters." "No, it was still the right thing to do, seeing as how we're both still clinging to the notion that we found the only honourable way to resign from our professions. I've scant eagerness to spend an eternity in hell's dark realm, ripped apart every day to be tossed into a giant iron kettle, to be gnawed at by dreaded Garm and his fellow witch dogs, which is the fate of all oath-breakers in the next life. An official statement of resignation, including an explanation of the reason behind it, was required from each of us." "Well, truth be told, I more alluded to the reason behind my sudden resignation and disappearance, rather than state it openly." "I suspect you managed to communicate the gist of it." All the while that they were talking, Bo was busy carving at the largest pumpkin with one of her many sharp knives. In time, she'd cut a wide circle clear around the pumpkin's fat stem, and with a great heave she lifted the heavy orange plug free from the rest of it. "Help me scoop this out," she said. "As soon as you finish explaining your cunning plan?" he said. "Simple enough. Once we've got this nicely hollowed out, I'm going to hide inside of it while you take us through the military checkpoint." "Why?" "Because I'm smaller than you are, silly man, and more limber. As big as this thing is, you'd never fit. I mean, why does one of us have to do it at all?" "Really?" she said. "You haven't figured it out yet?" "What can I say?" he said. "I'm tired from too many days with too little sleep, and from the constant stress of being on the run. And as you've so often pointed out, but always in a loving way, I can be dense at times." "It's simple. With me hiding in here and the plug pressed down just right so the cut doesn't show, you will then be a single man on his own bringing his goods to market. They aren't looking for a single man on his own. But even if you could be the one to fit inside this grandfather of all gourds, a single woman bringing her goods to market, though she may not fit the description of the particular fugitives they may be seeking, well, a woman alone attracts a different kind of unwanted attention." "Yes, I confess, that is rather clever." "Now that we've only one last obstacle remaining between us and the ship that can carry us away to this new world of sanctuary, I don't want to take any chances. So help me get down inside this pumpkin, Peter, my love, and then put the plug back in. And be sure to pile other vegetables all over the top, just to be safe." "Very well," he said, "but cut yourself a small air hole down low in the thing, and be sure to call out if you get a cramp or become claustrophobic." "I don't get claustrophobic, and why should I bother calling out?" she said with a wicked grin. "You'd likely not recognize my voice anyway." "Are we going to discuss that again?" His smile matched hers. I hadn't seen you in 10 years. It was dark. There was a bloody damned stone wall between us, an exceptionally thick one at that. You were whispering, and your mouth, along with your whole face, was swaddled in that long black scarf you like to wrap around your head as a mask. I have white blonde hair and perfect alabaster skin that shows up like a lit candle in even the darkest room. I need a mask in order to skulk about in the night. But granting all of those fine excuses you constructed, you'd still think a man would know the voice of his own true love. Please, oh eternal light of my life, get into the damned pumpkin. We really need to be on our way before anyone else comes along. Yes, dear. Thump once on the outside of it when you need me to be completely silent inside, twice when we're clear of the tower, and thrice once it's safe to come out. It turned out they needed to hollow out 2 of the largest pumpkins. One was required to conceal Bo as planned, and the other to hide their remaining treasure and all of your baggage that couldn't be explained as belonging to a poor young farm boy. Working together, they accomplished this in little time. Then, throwing the wet, stringy pumpkin innards over the hedge, Peter took the donkey's guide rope in hand and led the cart back on its interrupted way. The road meandered past fields and farms, then its winding character increased as it began to turn more sharply back and forth on itself, beginning its ascent into the hills. Peter led the cart up gentle grades and steep ones. Sometimes the donkey resisted, digging all 4 of its surprisingly strong hooves into the dirt and braying its protests loudly. Peter tugged on its rope while he cursed and bargained and pleaded with it. "Come on, Gertrude," he complained. "Once we get to the top, it's downhill all the rest of the way, I promise." When this happened, sooner or later, he'd find the right combination of applied force and spoken imprecations to get the stubborn beast started again, and they pressed on. Still going uphill, they quickly left the fields behind and passed through scattered woods of maple, ash, and hawthorn, their leaves already dressed for the fall. Gradually, these gave way to holly, and then scrub pine, that sometimes clung to the sheer sides of the granite cliffs with impossible daring and determination. In the late afternoon, after a series of grueling switchbacks, they finally turned the corner and saw up close the dark tower Bo and Peter had only scouted from a distance the day before. The tower just sat off the road, which had grown quite narrow in the pass, threading a slim notch between steep scarps. A high wall and portcullis gate reached out from either side of the tower, sealing off the scant space between impassable rock cliffs. Any traveller would have to pass by the tower, through the barred gate, or turn back. There was no other option. Peter spotted one fat, squat goblin soldier at the open gateway, stationed so that he could release a single rope and thereby send the iron bars crashing down to close off the passageway. Another 2 gob troops, armed with curved horn bows, paced the tower top 3 stories above them. Peter paused the cart while still out a ways from the tower and walked once around it, as if inspecting how its contents might have shifted during the ascent. As he did so, he gave a single offhand thump against the largest pumpkin, nestled deepest into the cart's bed. Then he took Gertrude's guide rope once more in hand and proceeded the remaining 30 feet towards the checkpoint. All the way up the hill, Peter had silently practiced all of the possible answers he'd give to as many questions as he could anticipate. He also made a few grim decisions on how he'd conduct himself if the guards got too curious about the cart and its contents. In his years of thieving, he'd practiced often with various weapons until he was familiar with all of them and an expert with some. He could place a thrown dagger within an inch-wide circle from nearly 20 paces, but he'd never once had to use a weapon in earnest. However, when Bo's life is at stake, he decided, I'll kill anyone I need to and not shed a tear of remorse afterwards. All of this he had in his mind when he approached the gate, but the bored goblin guard simply waved him through without making him stop or asking him a single question. 50 yards further down the twisting road they'd circled 3/4 round a giant pillar of rock and were well out of sight of the guard tower. Peter thumped 3 times on the big pumpkin and then helped Bo climb out of it and rub life back into her cramped limbs. "That feels grand," she said as Peter massaged her legs. "Don't stop." "You smell like pumpkin pie," Peter said. "I dearly love pumpkin pie, especially the way Queen Gisela used to make it for me, back in the Brotherhood. You're making me hungry." "We'll have a proper supper in town," she said, "including as much pie as you like. We deserve a small celebration before looking for the Tenacious and her captain." According to the information they'd purchased, at a dear price, the 3-masted trading ship Tenacious should be anchored at Sonnensea until the end of October, at which time it would make sail in its last voyage of the year, bound for its winter port. But along the way, or so they were told, the captain could be bribed into making a brief side trip, crossing a patch of magic-impregnated sea that connected to the seas of a much different world, the world of sanctuary they'd heard so much about over the years. Anchoring off a nearby shore that was sometimes an island and sometimes part of a vast continent, they'd be put ashore to find their new lives in a new world, while the Tenacious sailed off to complete its appointments back in the Hesse. "Well, isn't this a fine picture?" someone said, startling the couple. "I set off looking for one old score to settle and find 2. Fortune is indeed my sweetheart." Both Peter and Bo came instantly alert as a tall, slim figure appeared from around another bend in the road ahead of them. The newcomer was dressed in tunic, hose, and a long coat, all of many discordant colors. He had long brown hair and a beard of the same shade. Both were so wild and tangled that they looked as if they'd never known the touch of a comb. The man carried a flute of deep red wood, and he had a mad and predatory look in his dark eyes. Despite the years and wealth of changes in the fellow, Peter recognized him instantly. "Max!" he cried, relaxing his hand from the dagger he'd instinctively sought out inside the open lapel of his jacket. Bo hadn't made the connection as fast as Peter had, not realizing this was a husband's long-lost brother until Peter had named him aloud. But she'd known in the first moment that the man intended to kill them both. The evidence of it was written there in his eyes for anyone to read it. "Careful, Peter," she warned. "He has blood in his heart." "Your little bitch has the right of it," Max said. "I am going to kill the both of you, slowly and quite painfully, in point of fact. But that doesn't preclude a friendly chat first. It's been so long. How have you been, brother? Have you had many adventures since we were separated, oh, so long ago? The witch mentioned you had quite a few of note when she finally put me on your trail last month." But Bo hadn't waited for Max to finish his grotesque pretense at a friendly conversation. She sprang into deadly action immediately. Quick as a thought, 2 daggers flew towards Max, striking within an immeasurable moment of each other. But it wasn't flesh the daggers hit, but the air in front of him, as if an invisible shield of tempered adamant had been raised to protect him. The 2 knives hung, suspended in that solid wall of air for a moment, until one of them transformed into a red robin and flew away, while the other turned into a cluster of golden maple leaves that drifted merrily to the earth. Max gave no sign that he even noticed these miraculous occurrences or the violent acts that preceded them. He simply finished his questions to Peter as if they were having an enjoyable reunion in fact, as well as pretense. Peter was stunned, and for a long time had no idea what to do. Frost in its dull, worn and scuffed leather case was strung across his back, as always, but suddenly it seemed much heavier than normal. Peter could actually feel his brother's desire for it as a physical manifestation, as if his naked coveting was adding actual weight to it. Following the failure of her knives, Bowen stoppered a tiny blue glass bottle and spilled its contents towards Max's face. but the heavy amber liquid, which began to pop and sizzle once it met the air, turned into a fine mist before it could touch the man. The mist corkscrewed and whirled for a while above Max's head, dipping and twisting into a dozen remarkable formations before fading away into nothing. For the first time, Max turned to regard her directly. "Must you persist?" he asked, "while I'm trying to catch up with my baby brother? You can't harm me. Over the years, as I traversed many a dark and blasted land, I played 100 impenetrable armors and protections about myself. Neither you nor any of your child's toys can touch me, save that I wish it so." Bo answered him by closing the distance between them and delivering a kick that would have exploded his kneecap had it landed, but it simply slipped aside without contact. Undeterred, she kicked again and punched and slashed at him with the edges of a hand and with the third blade that she produced seemingly from nowhere. True to his boast, nothing she tried could touch him. "You weary me, Bo Peep," Max said. Then turning to his brother, he said, "Peter, I'm going to do you one last favor before I kill you today. First, I'll give you an executioner's divorce from this annoying harlot. At least you'll have a few minutes of joy back in your life before the end." Max raised his flute to his lips and played a single loud note, which caused Bo to be lifted, as if by a giant's unseen hand, and then tossed far away from him. The road, which wound around a massive pillar of rock on one side, dropped off in a sheer cliff on the other side. Bo flew helpless towards the drop-off, tumbling through the air like a jester's comic pantomime of a circus acrobat. At first it looked as if she might strike the last few feet of solid horizontal road surface before reaching the edge, but instead she flew past it. Then, at the last second, with a scream of agony as her arm was nearly wrenched out of its socket, she managed to reach out and grab a branch of one of the scrub pines that clung like a spider to the vertical rock face. The tree was anchored just below the lip of the road. Too far away to be of any help to her, Peter gasped in incandescent horror, waiting a terrible second to see if Bo would manage to hang on, or if the small tree would give way. She did, and it didn't. Slowly and painfully, she was able to grab the tree with her other hand, improve her grip with the first hand, and pull herself up and over the lip of the precipice. "That was a bit closer than I liked," she said, attempting a rakish smile. Peter couldn't say anything over the violence of his own heart pounding in his chest. Then Max blew another single half-note on his pipe, and Bo flew back again, this time disappearing entirely over the ledge, with no lucky branch within reach to help her. "No!" Peter screamed, rushing towards the cliff's edge. "You're well rid of her," Max said. "She always was a brat and a pest." Peter looked down over the ledge and spied Bo, lying perhaps as much as 20 feet below him, in the middle of the road, the same one he was on, which had obviously turned back on itself again, somewhere around the bend, to continue its descent down the cliff face. She seemed unconscious, but he could see that at least she was still breathing. There was some blood on her scalp, and one of her arms lay twisted at an unnatural angle. Max was standing well back from the ledge. He couldn't know that Bo was still alive, and Peter decided to keep it that way. This should have been a fight solely between the two of us anyway, he thought. With a cry of rage, he turned on his brother, hurling his own favorite throwing knife as he did so. It splashed against Max's invisible shield like water, which then fell to the ground in a miniature rainfall of 1,000 cooling iron shards. "I can't believe you tried that," Max said, "after seeing your late wife fail so miserably at the same thing." "I wanted to see if your magic shield worked differently, under different conditions," Peter said, "such as if you weren't expecting an attack from your own brother." "Aren't you clever?" Father always pegged you as the smart one. You should have sworn off the musical life and entered the philosophic world instead, where you could have experimented with worldly phenomena, investigated the true nature of nature, and charted the stars in their courses. But your theory in this case was, what's the word real philosophers use? Invalid. In any case, let me assure you, my protections aren't all that conditional and can't be fooled or distracted. So what do we do now? Peter said, all the while wishing with every fibre of his being that Bo should stay safely unconscious below, making no sound until he figured a way out of it. Now I kill you, but before that, I'll have my rightful inheritance, the flute that you stole from me. And though I could play a tune that would have you dancing on the end of my strings, forcing you to hand it over, I'd much rather have frost from your hand, freely given. We both know I should have gotten it in the first place, and I expect you to acknowledge that much, without coercion. But you have another flute, Peter said, much more powerful, with darkest magic from what I can see. Isn't that enough? Fire is so much more powerful than frost that they can hardly be compared, one with the other. But no, to answer your question direct, it's not enough. Fire is mine by right of conquest. I found it and tamed it to my will. But frost is also mine because it's my birthright. I'll have both. And after I give frost to you, you let me live? Each of us free to go on our own way? No, not at all. Weren't you listening? After that, I'm going to kill you. What happened, Max? We used to love each other. You couldn't have simply pretended that affection for all those years. I know it. So what? We also both used to shit our pants with reliable frequency. We grow older and learn better. Very well then. Peter slipped Frost's case from around his neck and shoulder. Then he opened the case and slid Frost out of it, white and gleaming like an icicle. But instead of handing it over to Max, who reached out for it with one hand, Peter brought it to his lips and began to play. Danger, pass me by, he silently implored as he played. Are you serious? Max smiled. It's a battle of flutes you want? Very well. Let's see what we shall see. He raised fire once again and began to play. This time it wasn't just a single note he played, but a mad and intricate melody that seemed to speak of monstrous things coursing through the night on their wild hunt. It was the sound of ancient bindings snapping, letting great and terrible old powers loose again in the world to enact their vengeances of untold ages. Max played the anthems of every dark thing that lurked and growled in the back of pitch-black caves. In response, Peter played a song of bright hope and escape. Danger, pass me by, he chanted over and over in his mind. Go away from here, Max. Go far away. But fire was truly more powerful than frost. Almost as soon as Max had begun playing, a burning sensation began in Peter's feet and started working its slow but steady way up his legs. Peter could feel his flesh begin to pucker and boil. The pain was incredible, but still Peter played on. Danger, pass me by. Go far away, Max. Run back up the hill through the tower gate and never stop until you're 1,000 leagues away. The burning in his legs continued, growing higher up his limbs and ever more painful. Through an impossible force of will, Peter managed to keep playing, but he began missing notes. Then he faltered for full measures. It was no use. His song couldn't be heard and understood against the more commanding tune his brother played. Peter's efforts was a gentle prayer of deliverance, which was lost in the maelstrom of Max's thundering tale of gods and monsters in desperate battle. Then, just as he was about to surrender, unable to stand for much longer on legs that had twisted out of true and had begun to smell of burnt and rotting flesh, a final, desperate idea occurred to him. He began playing again, but this time he didn't try to counter Max's tune. Instead, he joined it. At first, he merely played along, the same wild song Max did, trying to anticipate his composition and match him, note for note. Then, slowly and tentatively at first, but with more confidence every second, Peter began to strike out on his own, still following Max's central melody, but weaving a manic counterpoint to it, creating diabolic harmonies on the spot, dancing his notes between each one of Max's. Danger, pass me by. Peter no longer implored or pleaded his request. He demanded it. Danger, pass me by. Go far away, Max. Run up that hill, through the tower gate, and never stop until you're 1,000 leagues away. He saw Max just a few feet removed from him. As Max played, a worried look crept into his eyes. What was Peter doing to his song? Peter was guiding it, taking it over, and leading it off in directions Max didn't want it to go. Peter continued to play, feeling a dozen trickles of blood coursing down his chin and neck, pooling and soaking into the rough weave of his shirt. Frost was exacting its accustomed price for its magic. Peter played Max's song, and note by note took it away from him. In his mind, Peter felt turbulent sensations he'd never known before, lunatic angers he never believed he could possess flared within him with a frenzied and malign passion. But at the same time, little by little, he felt the pain recede from his deformed hips, traversing its way back down his groin and upper legs. He felt flesh knit back into place. Now it was Max who began to miss notes. I'm a thief, Max, and you always knew the truth of that. And now I'm stealing your song away from you, turning it down my own pathways, taking it to places you dare not follow. And all the while Peter continued to think, danger, pass me by. Go far away, Max. Run up the hill, through the tower gate, and never stop until you're 1,000 leagues away. The pain began to recede, farther and faster down Peter's legs. His twisted bones strained to find their original shape again. Danger, pass me by. Go far away, Max. Run up that hill through the tower gate and never stop until you're 1,000 leagues away. Somewhere far away, barely making itself known through the dual distractions of the maniacal song he played, and his internal litany of commands that Frost make danger pass him by for the third and last time, Peter heard a distant moaning that grew into screams of pain. That's Bo, Peter thought. She's finally woken up to discover her broken arm. Nothing I can do about it, not yet. Peter continued to play, leading the song in every respect, turning it incrementally into something better, something less openly malignant. The pain had almost entirely left Peter's legs and feet now. In a moment, he knew they'd be whole and unscarred again, as if they'd never been harmed at all. He heard more screaming from over the ledge, even more insistent, but still he played on. Then, all of a sudden, a great and racking sob of profound anguish escaped Max's lips. He abruptly stopped playing, dropped fire from his lips, and nearly dropped it from his frantically clutching hands, which opened and closed in violent, spastic twitches, obeying no thought or design. Without further utterances, save an almost inaudible whimper, tears streaming copiously from his eyes, Max turned and started running. He ran uphill, away from the seaside town, back up the road towards the guard tower and the endless lands beyond. Winning the duel with Max had left Peter exhausted and nearly insensible, but the pull of his obligation towards Bo wouldn't let him rest. Leaving the donkey and cart where it was, Peter ran down the road, taking the switchback at a mad dash that nearly spilled him off the ledge. He wiped blood away from his face as he ran, not wanting to frighten Bo with his wounds that were dramatic, but only superficial. Later he'd count at least 30 new small cuts on his lips, on his tongue, and at the corners of his mouth. Bo was still conscious when he reached her, but instead of favoring her broken arm as he'd pictured, she was writhing and clutching at her legs, crying and screaming in a pain too intense to be accounted for by a mere twisted limb, or even a broken one. Bo's too strong for that, he thought. And then a horrifying realization came to him, just as he noticed the rotting flesh smell. He cut away the dark brown hose covering her legs, using his last remaining knife, but even as he did so, he knew what he'd find underneath. Bo's legs were a burned and twisted ruin. In some places, bits of charred flesh were sloughing off, leaving open slashes of bloodied and withered muscle underneath. "I did this," Peter cried, though Bo was in no condition to understand him. "I did this to you. I wished the danger to pass me by, which is exactly what it did. It didn't disappear, but it bypassed me only to go somewhere else." Later, Peter walked back up the road to retrieve the donkey and its cart. He led it down to Bo, where he emptied it of enough of its contents to allow Bo to lie in it. The pain she suffered as he lifted her onto its bed made her pass out. He led the cart down the road, winding its way out of the high cliffs, which gradually became hills and then seaside lowlands. He'd take her into town and use all of his remaining treasure to find the magicians and physicians she needed to save her. She woke only once during the journey, and then only for a moment. "Where's Max?" she asked, in a voice drained of most of its former power. "He's gone, far away," Peter said, and he knew that it was true. Some lingering effect of the spent magic let him know for a certainty that everything he demanded of the duel had come to pass. Max wouldn't stop running until he was at least 1,000 leagues distant. If only he thought to demand just a little bit more from Frost's last service to him. Bo's breathing was weak, broken and hesitant for the rest of the trip into town. For most of the way he wondered if she'd still be alive when they arrived.